Chapter 7, Skeletal System, Bone Structure and Function, Part 2. So, as I was saying, the bony matrix is composed of organic materials produced by the osteoblasts, which includes collagen proteins, long collagen protein fibers, and a semi-solid ground substance. And this gives the bone its tensile strength, allows it to resist stretching, resist breaking, and contribute to its overall flexibility. Also, of course, included in bone matrix is the inorganic components, the calcium and phosphate that it pulls out of the bloodstream, and this eventually becomes crystals called hydroxyapatite. These crystals are deposited around the collagen fibers, and this hardens the matrix, giving the bones their hard rigidity. Bone tissue deposition, of course, begins with the osteoid, the organic material, and then the calcification process, where the hydroxyapatite crystals are deposited. Some vitamins that are helpful in this process include vitamin D. Vitamin D, it turns out, enhances absorption of calcium by the gastrointestinal tract. So by getting sufficient vitamin D, it helps make sure there is sufficient calcium within the bloodstream. And also required is vitamin C. Vitamin C, it turns out, is needed for the production of collagen and those long collagen fibers that are critical for the bone's integrity. And of course, you need to get enough calcium and phosphate in your diet. And the production of additional bone material is stimulated when the calcium levels in the bloodstream are high in order to help lower them and to store the calcium for when it may be needed later. Bone resorption, the breakdown of the bone matrix, destroys the organic material and releases the minerals, calcium and phosphate. So the osteoclasts get stimulated, they release enzymes from their lysosomes that then break down the organic material, and then they also release hydrochloric acid, which dissolves the crystals, the hydroxyapatite, releasing the calcium and phosphate. And this is, of course, stimulated when blood calcium levels are low, because calcium is so important for so many important functions of the body. It's more critical to have appropriate calcium levels in the bloodstream than to have properly maintained bone infrastructure. Normally, these two processes work together. The bone resorption, breaking down the organic material, and bone deposition, the building up the organic material, come together in a process called bone remodeling, so that the bones are constantly being broken down and built up, and overall, though, they maintain the proper integrity of the bones, as well as keeping the calcium levels in the bloodstream at the ideal levels. So bone remodeling, these two processes working together. Good old homeostasis. All right, going to histology, we move on to look at structures found within the compact bone tissue. The fundamental structure of compact bone tissue is the osteon, which is composed of many concentric rings of bone tissue known as concentric lamellae, surrounding an open space known as the central canal. And within that central canal, you'll find the blood vessels, nerves, lymph vessels that are important for the bone to stay alive. And the central canal, turns out, runs up and down the length of the bone itself. Now, between the layers of lamellae are little bitty spaces or pockets called the lacuna for one, lacunae for many. Within the lacunae is where you find the osteocytes. So osteocytes live in the lacunae found between the lamellae. And the osteocytes need to still be in contact with each other and with the blood vessels of the central canal so that they can get the nutrients they need and get rid of the waste they need to get rid of. And the way this occurs is there are these teeny tiny little channels running throughout the bone tissue called canaliculus for one, or canaliculi for many. And the osteocytes actually have little processes that travel and go through the canaliculi, making contact with other osteocytes and eventually forming a link to the central canal. Also within the lamellae are, of course, those collagen fibers. There's some very important collagen protein fibers. And it turns out that each sheet, each layer of lamellae has the collagen fibers oriented in a different direction, so that the orientation is varied by 90 degrees between layers of the lamellae. This helps to increase the bone's strength and its resilience to damage, to stress, to twists, and so on. Also found in the compact bone tissue is interstitial lamellae. These are leftover lamellae from older osteons that have been broken down by bone remodeling. So between the osteons, the little gaps or spaces are filled with the interstitial lamellae. Then around the outside and inside of the compact bone is structures known as circumferential lamellae. So the circumferential lamellae go around the circumference of the bone, all the way around the outside of the bone, and all the way around the inside of the bone. And then finally, we have the perforating canals. These are spaces that run the width of the bone. And within the perforating canals, you will find, surprise, surprise, blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. Again, the bone is very dynamic, very alive, and has lots and lots of blood vessels and nerves. Spongy bone. Spongy bone is somewhat similar to compact bone tissue in that it possesses lamellae, layers of bone tissue. It has lacunae where there are osteocytes, and it has canaliculi stretching out between the lacunae and out to the surface of the bone tissue. However, spongy bone does not have osteons. It does not have that concentric ring structure. Instead, they have trabeculi. Trabeculi are just a meshwork of crisscrossing bars stretching out throughout the spongy bone tissue with lots and lots of spaces where you'll find bone marrow. And it turns out this meshwork structure is actually really great because it provides a great resistance to stresses, makes the bone very, very strong, but also makes the bone weigh less. And that makes it more useful for our bodies because we don't want to have to develop huge overworked muscles to move extremely heavy bones. Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is, of course, the main cartilage you find in and on bones. It is obviously has an extracellular matrix that's sort of gel-like with a high level of water. No calcium, no crystals within it. It makes for great in compressibility, so it can get squished, it can absorb shocks, help to protect bones from impacts. The chondroblasts are the cells that produce the cartilage's matrix. They're found at the surfaces of the hyaline cartilage. And then the chondroblasts become surrounded by the organic material. They then form little lacuna. One lacuna filled with a chondroblast becomes a chondrocyte, and the chondrocytes help maintain the matrix of the hyaline cartilage. And then on the surface of the hyaline cartilage, on top of the chondroblast, is a structure known as the perichondrium. It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue, helps to cover the cartilage, maintain its shape, and also it carries blood vessels and nerves along the surface of the cartilage. However, as you can see in this image, the hyaline cartilage is avascular. There are no blood vessels running through it. So with this chart, you can see some of the similarities and differences between bone tissue and hyaline cartilage. Osteoblasts versus chondroblasts, osteocytes versus chondrocytes, calcium, yes, in bone tissue, no in hyaline cartilage. Bone is highly vascularized, while hyaline cartilage is avascular. Now, cartilage is dynamic, is alive, and is able to grow. It starts developing when we are embryos, and actually the hyaline cartilage helps to form the cartilage model that then is used to become bone tissue. Now, cartilage itself can also grow. It can grow in length through interstitial growth, which occurs in the internal structures of the cartilage. And it can also grow by width, also known as apositional growth, which occurs on the edges, the outer edges of the cartilage. So interstitial growth, well, we have the chondrocyte within its lacuna, and the chondrocyte will become active mitotically and divide to form two cells within the lacuna. These two cells are now chondroblasts. The chondroblasts will then secrete more organic matrix, slowly separating the two into two separate lacuna. And then the chondroblasts will become chondrocytes once again. So that is how cartilage grows internally, with cells dividing and producing organic material to separate them into their own single unit apartments. Apositional growth again occurs near the surface of the cartilage underneath the perichondrium. Here, the stem cells that become chondroblasts divide and produce new chondroblasts at the periphery. They will then produce new organic matrix that will surround them, push them apart, and soon they are in their own lacuna, and then they become chondrocytes. So basically, division at the surface, production of more organic material, and eventually the chondroblasts are separated in their own new lacunae, and then they become chondrocytes. All right, bone formation. Bone formation occurs through two main processes that start when we are an embryo and continue through childhood and adolescence. This includes intramembranous ossification and endochondrial ossification. Intramembranous in a membrane, endochondrial inside cartilage. So intramembranous ossification occurs in 4 stages. First, you have a big sheet of embryonic tissue in the head. So this is how we form the flat bones of the skull. So again, big sheet of embryonic connective tissue. And then within that tissue, many different spots, osteoblasts will develop. And these osteoblasts will begin producing the organic material, the osteoid material of bone tissue. The osteoid, the organic material of bone matrix, will then become calcified and hardened, and osteocytes will begin to form within the calcified material inside their lacunae, and of course the osteoblasts around the edges will continue to expand the size of these ossification centers. Eventually, the ossification centers throughout this tissue will connect up and form the trabeculi that are, again, what we expect to see in woven bone, in spongy bone. So we get to see the spongy bone tissue forming, the blood vessels getting incorporated in among the trabeculi, periosteum beginning to form along the edges. And then finally, through bone remodeling, we get the lamellar bone or compact bone tissue on the outside, the spongy bone in the middle, the periosteums along the surface, giving us what is spongy bone, the thin bones, the flat bones that we expect to find in the skull. With endochondrial ossification, this has 6 stages. First, that hyaline cartilage model is formed, giving you basically hyaline cartilage in the places where you expect to see most of the bones of the body, except, again, those flat bones found in the skull. And we will stop here for now, continue in the next lecture.